Thank you for joining Grace at the Circle. I wanted to have an online component or have a way for people who aren't in the Buffalo area to join in to our program. And if I were more tech savvy, I would probably have like a Facebook Live or a video. Maybe we'll get up to that at some point. But for now, I think this is good for our purposes. Um, at Grace at the Circle, we're going to look at one topic in the Bible over the course of a year, and this year's topic is going to be poverty in the Bible. And I need to apologize in advance because I have a pretty bad cold that I need to get over. So I'm apologizing in advance if there's a lot of sniffling in the background. Please bear with me. So that's me. I'm Gabrielle Atchison. I have a doctorate in women's studies, and a few years ago I went to Yale Divinity School, primarily to study pastoral care and counseling because I felt like there would be a time when I would be working with survivors of gender-based violence in different ways, and I wanted a spiritual foundation to work with that group. But I also really got excited about the Bible a few years before that, and I wanted to go somewhere where I could explore it with theologians, and it was a very exciting, probably the most exciting 2 years of my life. What I learned the most about the Bible being there was that I had the authority to read and think for myself, and I think that's the main takeaway from being part of that community. That we have the right, and actually is probably what we're supposed to do, is to get together in groups and try to discern what the Bible means for our lives. Um, so for me, Jesus' teaching specifically, but the Bible as a whole, is very intricately connected to social justice. There's not really a division between those two things. So it's easy when you have that sort of framework to think about the connection between real life and the Bible. So this is part of the reason I wanted to take this journey. Grace at the Circle is called Grace at the Circle because we're meeting at a church called St. John's Grace, which is on 51 Colonial Circle, and I thought that was really nice. And many years from now, no one will know why we called it that, but that's why it's called that. We're going to meet at that church in a room that looks like a parlor, like your grandmother's house that had a parlor where you could sit down on a couch and talk to people around you, called the Walter Lord Room. We're meeting on the last Monday of every month, and there's more information later on the presentation. We're also going to have field trips, which I wanted to design around a desire to do small or short-term service projects, but also to get involved with the many interfaith communities that are in the Buffalo area. So we had one field trip, which was really cool, and we'll do some more as the year goes on. And then the online community. So I wanted to create these webinars. I have a web page and an online forum for people to give their comments and hopefully read each other's comments and begin having a dialogue about the things we discuss together. So I believe that the Bible is a diverse set of writings. I believe that if you felt like the Bible was the inerrant word of God, that you could still get something out of Grace at the Circle. But for the most part, I've come to believe that it's not one coherent document, and it cannot be read in a straightforward way. And that you miss a lot if you think of it as something that can be read in a straightforward way, or even something that will, like a guide for your life. If you just kind of read it, it'll tell you what to do. It's more like a collection of things, and as you form more of a personal relationship with God, you can study the Bible. You can read what other people think. You can come up with your own ideas about it. Um, but what's really important is that it's a collection of different things. Um, there uh, there is There is within the UCC Church an idea or the motto that God is still speaking. Um, so the idea that you can read the Bible alongside texts that are written in our current time um, really appeals to me. So what I wanted to do with this first year at least was to combine looking at the Bible with also looking at some other texts. Um, so I've created Grace at the Circle in an effort to explore these themes with other people who are believers and people who are seekers. We will spend 1 year, a cycle, focusing on a specific theme. We'll start with the biblical writers and then incorporate the voices of contemporary writers of social commentary and religious thought. So like I was saying, the first cycle will explore the theme of poverty. I I also like the idea of looking at themes of violence in the Bible. Definitely, we'll talk about themes of gender and sexuality, which is very interesting. So those would be some of the ideas for themes for following years. If you have ideas, I'm open to hearing those as well. So I chose Elsa Thomas's book, Bible of the Oppressed, to talk about the theme of poverty in the Bible. And she divides her book into two sections. The first section, she talks about the Old Testament, and then in the second section, she talks about the New Testament. So for our August meeting, we're going to address the first half, and then the September meeting, we'll talk about the Gospel, the New Testament. So that's the picture of Elsa Thomas and three of her books. I've only read the first one, Bible of the Oppressed, which is what this is based on. But she also has a number of books, The Scandalous Message of James, When the Horizons Close, rereading Ecclesiastes, and also Through Her Eyes. So check those out as well. So just a little background on Elsa Thomas. She was born in Mexico in 1950. Her PhD is in theology. She's of the Liberation Theology movement. The Catholic Church, this movement grew out of the Catholic Church in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s, and is very grounded in the experience of the poor in Latin America, and this idea that the Catholic Church should be um, responsible for or take care of the poor within their countries. The Theology of Liberation is a book that was written by Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru, who articulated this phrase, God has a preferential option for the poor, which is the idea that God, or Jesus specifically, prefers people who are needy, insignificant, despised, and defenseless in our society. So the Bible talks a lot about, for example, widows and orphans, because there are people who aren't connected to power. A man who could have a name, who could have land, who could have money or power. And so if you didn't have a husband or you were a child who didn't have a father, then you would be sort of outside of having power, outside of probably having somewhere to live. So that's why the Bible talks about those two groups most often and how we're supposed to treat them. Like I mentioned earlier, we're looking at Bible of the Oppressed in two parts. Um, Elsa Thomas's method is to look at the Old Testament as a whole. And what she did was she looked at the Hebrew words. What she did was find 9 Hebrew words that mean something dealing with oppression. Um, and then she kind of organized those pieces of scripture to come up with themes across the Old Testament as a whole. And these are 2 quotations from the book. My intention in part 1 is to study the experience of oppression as recorded in the Old Testament. This means determining why oppression occurs, who the oppressors are, and who the oppressed are, what the characteristic traits of each of these 2 groups are, what the methods are that the oppressors use, and what forms the oppression takes. The second quotation says, "The story told in the various biblical accounts is one of oppression and struggle, as is the history of our Latin American peoples. In fact, our present story can be seen as a continuation of what we are told in biblical revelation. For this reason, I think that reflection on oppression and liberation in the scriptures is not to be regarded simply as a study of one more biblical theme, rather as the very substance of the entire historical context within which divine revelation unfolds. And only by reference to the central fact can we understand the meaning of faith, grace, love, peace, sin, and salvation." I pulled out a couple of the themes. This is a really great book. It's a short book. It's very, she's concise in the things that she's found. So if you're someone, for example, who wants to study this, or you wanted to put together a really amazing sermon, for example, on poverty in the Bible, this would be an excellent resource to have. What I did here was just to pull out a couple of the themes across that she came up with. And the first one was the idea that oppression degrades the poor. In their words, there's one of the words that she pulled out in the Hebrew actually means to squeeze or to press or to crush. So when this word was used, it was most often in one of the stories where the the feeling of being crushed by oppression made the people cry out for liberation. So if you can imagine the people in Exodus crying out because they didn't have water, and the people in Judges crying out because they were being oppressed by the larger power, this would be the word that was used, that could be translated into words like squeeze or press or crush. The oppressors, the rich, their only motivation is becoming wealthier, and they get that way by robbing the poor. The behavior is condoned by authorities and reinforced through violence. So one of the main points of Elsa Thomas's book is that the poor don't become poor just by nature, that there's a force or a group of people creating the poverty, creating the suffering of the poor, and she explains that all wealthy are actually responsible for the oppression of the poor. So I'm going to get back into my differences that I have compared to what she's saying here, but I wanted to first just to talk a little bit about what she's saying. So here's some more quotations. When injustice manifests itself in every aspect of a nation's life, we necessarily infer that structures of violence are being condoned by the authorities or by influential persons such as rulers, prophets, priests, and the wealthy. Also want to stop here to say that Elsa Thomas, her context in Latin America is similar to Jesus's context that he lived, and is also similar to our context. So I felt like when she was speaking about the oppression that was happening within her context, we could also talk about our own contemporary context in our modern day American context. And certainly, I feel like structures of violence are used by authority to keep the status quo, to keep things in place. So this book is really feeling relevant to me right now. Another quotation is, "The oppressors are rich and influential people who never feel satisfied with what they have. Their basic concern is to accumulate wealth. They turn to oppression and make use of various methods that bring them gain in one or another fashion. The oppressor's ultimate purpose is not to kill or impoverish the oppressed. Their primary objective is to increase their wealth at whatever cost. The impoverishment and death of the oppressed are a secondary consequence. In the methods used to achieve their goal, economic, ideological, and religious factors play their interrelated parts." So it's more like benign neglect, or that it's the oppression of the poor is not necessarily the first thought of the wealthy. It's just that they don't care, which isn't better, but it's just she's making a point there about the difference between intention and where the focus of the wealthy lie. So for Elsa Thomas, Yahweh, or the God who demands that justice is done, that God represents justice and what we would call social justice, and that's the purpose of God. And so, as such, God would be the defender of the cause of the poor, and that God aligns himself or God's self with the poor. Daka, which is one of the Hebrew words that she found as a theme throughout the Bible, talks about oppression dehumanizing the poor. And this word could also be translated into grind to dust, to crush. And she talks about how you might crush the person, or you might crush a heart, or you might crush a soul or a spirit of a person. And that the point for me is that oppression reaches into the innermost being of a person. Later on, we're going to talk about Howard Thurman, who's an African American theologian of the 30s and 40s, who actually influenced Martin Luther King. And he's going to address what he calls people with their backs against the wall, who are African American, poor African American people being oppressed in the pre-civil rights American world. So where there are very few legal rights. Anyway, see what he was trying to ask, what he asked in his in the book that we're going to read is, does Jesus's message talk to the people whose backs are against the wall? And he does a really good job of explaining the dehumanizing, how it's dehumanizing to be in this situation, and some of the strategies that people in that situation use that are short term, that don't do well on the long term in terms of creating change, but make a lot of sense in terms of what people are going through, and then offers back what he feels like Jesus can offer in terms of humility. So stay tuned for that. Um, so the most important point, according to Gabrielle, is that the entire ruling class conspires against the powerless, oppressing them to the point of killing them in order to acquire what they have. Ezekiel defines the righteous person as one who does not oppress anyone. Righteousness requires that we undo yokes and free those who are bound by them. It calls for still more profound struggle in which we seek to tear out at the roots the reasons for all the yokes that exist in society and get rid of them. So, what I feel like she's saying here is that the ruling class or the wealthy need to be held accountable for the things that they're doing that cause the suffering of others. But that also, if we're going to call ourselves righteous and live our lives in terms of social justice, then we also have a work to do. Like, we can't be passive. We can't just feel like it's good enough to not harm other people. We actually have to be actively involved in alleviating the suffering of others. And I like what she talks about, undoing yokes. So for me, the yokes are societal or systemic kinds of oppression, going and examining and dismantling the systems that hold people down. So I wouldn't say either or. Like, I think we do both. We go and try to help the immediate suffering of people, but also work together across differences to try to eliminate some of the things that cause the oppression of other people as well. The two more points. One is that the oppressed are the poor, and they are oppressed because they are poor. So there's prejudice and disdain for people who are poor, and they're often used as scapegoats for social problems. And they are poor because they're oppressed. So the actions of the oppressors create poverty and work to keep them impoverished. Also, like I was saying before, the idea of the doubly oppressed are groups that are separated from power. The orphans and the widows are mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. And what I want you to do is to think about who are the widows and orphans of our time. Like think about what what groups are separated from structures of power and are most vulnerable in our society, and how can we take some of these lessons from Elsa Thomas to help groups of people who are particularly vulnerable. So these are two Gabrielisms, and you can take them or leave them. But I think they're very relevant to why I have these particular ideas about what Elsa Thomas is saying. The first one is eschatology, which is a word that basically describes your belief in what happens at the end of times. So the way I'm reading it as a whole, in terms of Christian theology, is two ways. So either there was a Jesus and Jesus died, was resurrected, and leaves us a comforter, and will eventually return. So in this idea, everything is belongs to God. We are supposed to be stewards, which are the people who are responsible for taking care of God's things, God's people, God's animals, God's plants, God's earth. We're supposed to take care of this while God is gone, while Jesus is gone. And then Jesus returns, separates the good from the bad, and takes the good with Jesus, and then the rest, really horrible things happen. You can read Revelation to read what happens at the end in terms of that model. So in that model, it would be important to take care of poor people, because at any point Jesus would return, and part of how you get to go with Jesus is because you saw the person who needed something to eat and you gave them food, and you gave the person who needed something to drink water, and you needed the person that needed clothes, and you visited the people in the hospital. So all of that's pretty much clarified in Matthew 25, and that's how we are good stewards of God's earth. The other model that I feel is there, but maybe a little bit more subtle, is the idea that the kingdom is here already. That Jesus's time, when Jesus came, that represented a dismantling of the division between God and people. And so the kingdom that we're working towards is actually here, and has been here since Jesus was here, and we just didn't realize it. And so we have this situation. If you ever have heard the phrase living hell, or heaven on earth, that's closer to what we're supposed to be thinking about, that we're supposed to create a heaven here for people, in the sense that alleviating the suffering of some people and trying to get people who do suffering to cause the suffering of others to stop and change and help out, right? So somehow justice or equality is possible, and since it's not happening right now, our whole effort needs to be put into creating equality, creating justice, so that the people who are suffering don't have to suffer anymore. This second thing that I'm trying to describe awkwardly is actually what I believe, and it puts a different emphasis on life, because now your whole purpose is about trying to find the people who are suffering and help them not suffer as much, and to fight for social justice so that things can be equal, so that we can have a living heaven here now. And it makes everything more urgent, and it makes us more responsible. It's not something that's going to come from outside to fix everything. We have to fix it. And then maybe actually when we've made enough effort towards bringing everybody together, maybe that's when God steps in. But it seems like there's more of a responsibility on us. But in that model and in the other model, there's room there's an emphasis on taking care of people who are suffering and who are poor. So it's not even important to believe or to think about it in one way or the other. In either model, and I think each one is really represented in the gospel, in the letters of Paul. Um, the emphasis on needing to care for the poor is there. It's just why you're doing it is different. I'll talk about that a lot more throughout the rest of the year. The second idea that I want to talk about briefly was that Elsa Thomas divides the world very strictly into wealthy and poor. But I feel like there's a group in the middle who are sometimes being oppressed, sometimes being oppressor, but for the most part are somewhere in between the abject poverty and suffering that Jesus is speaking to about, and the people causing the violence and causing the oppression of others. We are in between, right? We have this ability to um, see clearly what's going on and maybe try to work towards changing it. And I feel like those are the people Jesus walked around and talked to, and those are the people who Jesus is talking to now. So we have a twofold job. One is, like I said earlier, alleviating the pain of people who are suffering. But a second job that we have to do is to try to get people who oppress others to repent. And repent is talking about turning around, turning from their ways. One of the groups that actually oppresses the poor, I think the most, are not necessarily wealthy, but are people who are part of an industry to sort of steal money away from the poor. Like if you can imagine check cashing places or payday loans or these different like industries, rent-a-center, that just drain the poor of the limited resources that they have, and make it so that they never really can get ahead at all. Um, and most of these people are poor as well. They don't get rich doing that. They just get like a little bit more money. um, so for me, it's not as black and white. For me, there's sort of a middle group, and that the middle group is a lot. There's a lot of pressure on us because I think that we're the people who know better. We're the ones who Jesus is speaking to, and for us, it's not about trying to get over on someone, and it's not about trying to just survive each day. We're actually having to do a little bit more work. So those are just two things to think about as you go through your next couple weeks. So again, the question that we had earlier was, who are the widows and orphans of our time? And of all of these topics, we want to think about or talk about online or in person. How is this relevant? How is any of this relevant on a personal level or in our contemporary context? And the societal level, on a personal level, on a spiritual level, how is this stuff relevant? Because I think that keeps the conversation interesting. So that's it for this first topic. Please tune in, join in for September. We're going to continue the discussion of Bible of the Oppressed. There's the website, GabrielleJAtchison.com/grace-at-the-circle-the-circle. And you go there and then you can scroll down and find out how to be part of the online discussion. Thank you so much. Have a good day.